Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Leor Sapir, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a driven researcher with a PhD in political science from Boston College. Dr. Sapir previously completed his postdoctoral fellowship at the Program on Constitutional Government at Harvard University. His academic work, including his dissertation on the Obama administration's Title IX regulations, has investigated how America's political culture and constitutional government shape public policy on matters of civil rights. I welcome Leor Sapir to Savage Minds. I've been writing about this subject for a decade now, and I like to say this because it's true. I don't say it just for saying it. I intensely dislike this subject because I keep coming back to the problems that your article points out very coherently. The lack of scientific evidence, the problems with the epistemology behind what we're discussing, and a lot of the academic hokum that is circulated in order to create what I like to call, you use another term in your piece, but I call it an intellectual pyramid scheme, where everyone sort of, I'm going to write how elephants can fly, then you cite me about how I wrote that therefore elephants fly. And that's sort of what's gone on here in many respects. And your piece, so you had two pieces in City Journal that I've read. I loved them. The article from this spring, you open with an analysis of North Carolina's bathroom bill, covering the vast misrepresentations of this bill, with Attorney General Loretta Lynch comparing it to Jim Crow. I mean, really laugh or cry at that, to the Supreme Court's 2020 decision in Bostock versus Clayton County, which deemed that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects transgendered people and gay people from employment discrimination under ordinary public meaning, in quotes, of sex. But you go on to show how the opinion, which was written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, details the court's decision that specifies that sex-specific accommodations would not be affected. But you also go on to note, since that decision, anything but has happened. In fact, they've leaped to what he said should not be interpreted from that case. And at one point in your piece, you get at an issue I would like to kick off with, because your piece is so good. I could just read it every day.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it, because sometimes I've been sitting down to write a piece and I get very annoyed at the stupidity of what's gone on here. I sometimes just can't find the right words. And you do. And this is what I'm going to quote. At the heart of these legal controversies is the question of what makes people male or female. Without exception, courts in the education lawsuits have based their answer on what they have learned from the medical experts who testify or file amicus briefs on the behalf of transgender students. Yet the arguments that these experts present to federal judgments are highly partisan interpretations of an already limited and often methodologically flawed body of research. Their interpretations seem geared to producing a desired legal outcome rather than faithfully reporting on an ongoing medical debate. And that is the linchpin of what's been going on in the 10 years I've been involved in critiquing this madness. I see this over and over and over. I mean, just skip to transgender sports. We've got someone like Joanna Harper, who has been putting out information to support what the IUC had been doing with certain testosterone levels. But once again, we're arguing that we don't breathe water. We're arguing that gravity exists. And at the same time, we've got these people saying, oh, but sex is on a spectrum. You know, circa 2014-15, all over Twitter, in what was then very underground still, but all over the gender critical underground, this is what I got to read every day. Well, that's my gender identity. That's not my gender presentation. And you see them making this stuff up as they go along. And in the last paragraph of your piece, you were quite generous in your rendering of the debate. I used to be like that, and I'm far less, because I've had 10 years of seeing men purport to be women based on a stereotype, and vice versa for the women, although I would make a very big distinction between the two, because the reasoning for both are sociologically different. And a lot of people don't understand that. They're just like, well, anyone can identify as. And so I'm seeing the encroachment of men and women's safe spaces, changing rooms, prison cells. Recently in the UK, It was a scandal just last week where the police in Sussex were telling people not to misgender a child rapist who was about to be placed in a woman's prison. Can you believe that? Where there's a maternity ward. And so we're living in a really, and I'm a left person. Full confession, I taught gender studies, but not this stuff. I taught like when it was emerging, and it was queer studies was more of a liberatory voice from Walt Whitman to Proust to Oscar Wilde. It wasn't men can be women, that sex is mutable, that lesbians have penises. And the shark got jumped because I was living outside of the English-speaking world for many years. I was doing work in other countries, and I came back, and I'm gay myself. I was in a lesbian bar in the West Village in 1998 and saw all this stuff about trans, and I was like, what has that to do with us? Well, we were discriminated against too. And I was like, stevedores are discriminated against in certain parts of the world. I mean, we're not just going to add on everyone who wants to have an identity. Right. And in one of your pieces, I use an expression that you used in the title, I believe, about, it's the most recent piece you did just last week, that the T is piggybacking on the LGB. I use that expression, or they've hitched their caboose to our wagon. But it's all very almost consciously, and I guess seeing where the money's coming from, it's a quite conscious erosion of women's rights and gay rights under the moniker of liberation. But it's anything but. This is the most homophobic thing I've lived through in my life. I've never seen such homophobia, where now I see men who are taking up the most regressive stereotypes of women and telling gay men, if they don't sleep with trans men, and people like me, if I don't sleep with a lesbian with a penis, that we're transphobic. It's gone really nuts, Leor. Yeah. And so I read your piece, and that one section I just referred to me is the linchpin about what's happening. We've seen a bifurcation between factual, methodological work in this field. I've interviewed on the show people who are experts in neurology, like Gina Rippon. She was on the show. She's written a book about it. She's done work on the gendered brain. She has very clear information. No. In fact, the slight differences between male and female brains are so slight that, as she explained to me, if you just took randomly a brain and told a specialist, even her, to say, is it a man or a woman, it would be very difficult to do unless by size. Right? So we're seeing where there's a lot of, well, if you're going to say that men shouldn't be on the women's swim team, then what do you do with short men and tall men? Like, they like to jump to that conclusion too. Right. So this is, on the one hand, a philosophical issue that's crazy making, because the science is so far showing nothing. There were studies about 5 years ago, people tried to say were showing that there was a transgender brain, and there was no repetition of that one study. There was no proof, in fact, that there's a thing called that. But when you see the rhetoric coming out of this community, it's one stereotype after another after another. We knew how to bat this down when Rachel Dolezal told the world she was black. Right. Why has this become so acceptable that people lend a shoulder to Bridget because he thinks he's a woman? I think we've come to this very strange space where empirical and epistemological information is being vetted by those who have an interest to vet it. And the rest of us are being called bigots. So I want to sort of jump off with that section, because I do think the issue of what is being reported and what is being researched and then cited is a huge part of the problem, because you've got two camps. And you go over this also in terms of intersex conditions. The same thing, where you have Leonard Sachs in one corner, right? And then it's escaped her name.
Anna Fausta Sterling.
Yes, she hyperinflates those numbers based on something that, as you point out, those men in her additional numbers would never have known they had an intersex condition until fertility issues arise.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've put a lot on the table there, and I think I agree with virtually all of it. I mean, it strikes me that one of the reasons why this movement has managed to make so many inroads in our institutions, in particular, I think medicine and education, but also in criminal justice, you mentioned prisons and other institutions, and the media, the way in which it's spoken of and reported. The reason why it's made so many inroads and its accomplishments have been proven so hard to push back against is because I think a central tenet of this movement is no debate. no public expression of skepticism, no questioning of its claims ever by anyone for any reason, unless they are even more extreme in the views that they put forward. And in that regard, it's kind of this collective mania that we're going through, because if you can pin down an activist and actually have them defend their claims, you don't need an advanced degree in philosophy to quickly point out the obvious contradictions. And I go through some of those contradictions in my writings, but just to give you a couple examples, in the case, let's talk about sports for a second. The trans movement activists have said, and I can give you numerous examples of this by major trans rights organizations, including the Human Rights Campaign, the ACLU. They've said that the only proper determinant of whether a person is a man or a woman is their gender identity, that our physical attributes have absolutely nothing to do with it. But in the context of sports, they haven't been willing to make that argument, interestingly enough. They've said, no, all we're saying is that a blanket ban on all trans women from women's sports is overly broad and therefore unconstitutional. Meaning, according to their own logic, it would be perfectly legitimate and well within the bounds of the Constitution for a state to prohibit the participation of at least some people who identify as women from women's sports. Now, it's obvious from a political perspective why they would come to that position, because if they do away with the physical distinctions among the sexes and they say that male and female refer only to gender identity, women's sports is gone. Or at least on paper, it's gone, right? Some people would argue, okay, but there's so few trans athletes, they wouldn't really affect much. Okay, sure, but don't forget, you only need one Leah Thomas swimming in the pool to send these kind of ripple effects and a message to a whole generation of young women of don't even bother competing, I'll beat you. So even one or two prominent trans athletes in a particular area of competition can have massive demoralizing effects and can really kind of turn the clock back on women's sports. But to get back to my point, it's not convenient for trans activists to be consistent with their own arguments about human nature in the case of sports. So they just retreat to a different position. And you can call them out on this as much as you want. You can say, look, in lawsuits regarding bathrooms, you say that gender identity is the only thing that matters. In lawsuits regarding sports, you say, no, physical attributes do matter. Which is it? But those kinds of debates in which kind of philosophical positions can be investigated, interrogated, are just not happening. And they're not happening, I would argue, and I have made this point publicly, precisely because I think the trans movement is not oppressed and marginalized. On the contrary, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a better example of a movement representing such a tiny minority of people that exercises so much power and influence in the economic sphere. Think of kind of the total capture of this on this issue of corporate America. In the political sphere, you have the party in power, the dominant party in American politics, the Democratic Party, fully on board with this stuff, with absolutely no Democratic politician willing to even raise questions, let alone take a contrary position. In academia and media and peer review publications, medical associations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, sports organizations, it's one institution after the other that have all succumbed to this ideology. And I say ideology very loosely here because it's really kind of a bunch of incoherent ideas that contradict one another. And that to me is not an example of an oppressed minority. That is an example of a minority that exercises a huge amount of influence.
Hello? 10
Yeah.
years. In 10 years, they
Yeah.
have achieved so much power. They were
Yeah.
able, remember when the bathroom bill happened and PayPal
Yeah.
boycotted North
Oh yeah.
Carolina?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
want PayPal to boycott, I'm joking here. I want PayPal to boycott men. The
Yeah.
thing is, and I'm joking, but the reality is that we know that violence against women and girls is still a thing. With lockdown, it
Right.
was more of a thing. You son,
Right.
no lip service paid. I mean, I joke about this all the time because, well, I'm in a country where we were really, with Melbourne, probably the worst case studies of torture during lockdown, having to print out papers every other day, a different paper. Sometimes I'd have to go back in and, oh, that was from 2 days ago, and print a new one out because the government changes its mind like most people
Yeah.
change their underwear.
Right.
And I was thinking, all these senators in the Democratic Party worrying about pronouns when
Yeah.
human rights were being,
Yeah.
there was a lot of questions there. And getting back to something you said earlier, I also wanted to say what the ACLU has done, because which ACLU are you talking about? Because I don't know if you followed Chase Strangio on Twitter.
Yeah.
But this individual is completely against any kind of barring of males on girls' teams, or vice versa. Although vice versa doesn't really figure in. They use a lot of these quote unquote trans male athletes as window dressing because they're no menace.
Right.
And the ACLU position, though, it seems to be that there's this wavy thing happening with the ACLU on social media, because Strangio is always putting out stuff that goes counter to any kind of concession that men should not be on women's teams.
Right.
I think the problem with that goes back to, wait, if this lobby is going to say that sex is oppressive and it's a fiction, they say sex is between your legs and gender is between your ears. That's one of their 2015-16 statements they would make. The one question I always would give them, then, if sex doesn't exist, what are you transitioning to? You see? And this is a question no one wants to touch because, as you noticed, they constantly move the goalpost and change the discussion.
Right. I mean, so I've called this strategy lily hopping. So what I mean by that is that there really is, at least, and I'm going to talk about the American context, although it's very applicable to other countries too. But in the American context, there seem to be two independent conversations happening that both kind of together comprise the trans issue. One is a philosophical question about the basis of human sex differences. What is it that makes us male or female? Are there other categories of being other than these two? Is sex really assigned at birth? What is gender identity? How can it be scientifically verified? All these kinds of things, right? What is a lived experience? What differentiates it from a regular experience? What's its epistemological status? All these super fascinating and relevant questions are on the philosophical question of what is sex, what is gender? But then there's a separate set of questions that obviously overlaps with the first, that concerns medical treatment for a psychological condition nowadays known as gender dysphoria. And just to illustrate how these two questions can operate independent of one another, it's perfectly possible, at least kind of at a superficial level, it's perfectly possible for somebody to say, look, trans women are really men. But for those men who have severe gender dysphoria, and for whom, living as a woman, meaning having others recognize them as being a woman in certain contexts, alleviates that dysphoria. It makes their life livable for them. I am willing to treat a man as a woman. I'm willing to use that person's preferred name and pronouns. Of course, there's going to be limits to that with regard to prisons and sports teams, and maybe in certain circumstances, bathrooms and things like that. Certainly locker rooms, anywhere where full nudity is required or at least permitted. So we can make accommodations, but the question of how to treat gender dysphoria doesn't necessarily depend on the question of what really makes somebody male or female. We could all pretend that a man is really a woman or a woman is really a man if doing so is scientifically demonstrated to reduce their dysphoria. So that's why I mean, so there's these two different conversations. And when I say lily hopping, what I mean by that is that, especially in the context of the courts, lawsuits, which is where we Americans like to solve almost all of our problems in the courts. Every issue ultimately ends up in the courts. In the context of litigation, what you see is activists kind of just hopping from one of those issues to the next. And anytime the other side pins them down and almost gets them to show defeat, they just hop to the other issue. And it's impossible to achieve any kind of resolution. So just to give you an example, in the context of the Title IX lawsuits, where courts were asked whether if a school treats a female student who identifies as a boy, if the school refuses to allow that student to use the boys' restrooms, whether that's discrimination, quote, on the basis of sex and therefore impermissible under Title IX. the trans advocacy groups that have litigated this issue have said to the courts, look, gender identity is an innate and immutable property of persons. And we also have medical organizations saying that the only treatment for gender dysphoria is gender affirming care. But if you look at the amicus briefs and you look at the arguments and the analysis, the lawyers advocating on behalf of the trans plaintiffs don't prove either one of those arguments. And every time you think that they're just about to give you the kicker, the bottom line, the thing that would constitute evidence, they switch to the other argument. So that's what I mean by lily hopping. There's never an opportunity to just say, okay, let's now talk about the philosophical question and investigate it all the way through to its logical conclusion. So that's, I think, how this movement has managed to build so much momentum and to capture so many institutions and to achieve so much in the policy realm without actually having a coherent philosophical understanding of the human person, or without having good scientific evidence for the transitioning of children.
Well, the transitioning of children is like sports. Those are the two topics that even the pro-gender ideology folks, a lot of them will put brakes on and say, well, not all though. It's a bit disturbing even then, but we'll go into your most recent piece where you go over the polls in a bit, because that also reveals some interesting information. But I want to go back to what you just said. When I started working on this 10 years ago, I interviewed a feminist scholar from the UK, Julia Long. Met her in a cafe near my home in central London, and I was using the pronouns. And she stopped me and she said, "Why are you doing that?" A very nice woman. She talked to me about her views on that, and I had thought about this. And I'll tell you something. As a female, as a woman who grew up as a girl, one thing that we are socialized into doing is conceding. Conceding in all ways. The disparity in wages is not a fluke. It's not like it happens in Canada, but it doesn't happen in the States. It happens around the planet. And it happens because, well, go back to lockdown. The governments knew very well who was going to be doing the homeschooling. They knew very well which one of the parents would be giving up their jobs, their autonomy, their financial freedoms, in many cases, pensions, because a lot of people in Italy haven't been paying into their pensions, have been unemployed. They knew who that demographic was, and it wasn't the penis havers. And I say penis havers because I'm being ironic here. Now, I don't know if you have kept up with what's been going on in the UK, where Cancer UK called women cervix havers. We've been called menstruators. We've been called womb carriers. The most denigrating terms have been used by official government organizations, educational institutions, intellectuals in academia, publishers, well-known people within the arts and entertainment. I mean, we have been denigrated to such a point that when Julia Long asked me that question and I had to sit down and thought about it, she was right. And I'll tell you this also, and I use this example, but I've also spoken to other clinicians in the field, to include Ray Blanchard, and many at the Tavistock in London. Some of the whistleblowers have come on the show. And I asked many of these people, in all of psychiatric and psychological history, has there ever been one diagnosis of any sort where part of the recovery, part of the therapy is society will confirm? We can use anorexia. The feminists use this all the time. Am I going to go and tell Michelle that she is fat? She weighs 52 kilos, but at 5'10", she's fat. No. Am I going to go to my GP and say, I'm a kleptomaniac, and he's going to say, hey, we've got a solution for that. The NHS has a Visa Gold for you, so no more stealing, just buy on the state. So anything you want, just buy it. And I can go on and on. Stockholm Syndrome. I worked on a project of that in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, where I interviewed a subject who worked in cleaning up bodies after suicide bombers would explode themselves. And one of his criticisms of the Palestinian narrative was that they have Stockholm syndrome. They are in love with their oppressor and so forth, and explaining why Israelis who try to explain away what they perceive the ills of their government, that they're in love with their oppressor. And when I think about this, I think, would I go to my clinician and say, I've just been kidnapped and I want to marry my kidnapper? He's in jail, but would the therapist say, well, go marry him? Like, I have heard and not read of one psychiatric or psychological diagnosis where the response is society must mirror your desire, your self-perception, and what I would call your personality. Because I can't underscore enough, Leor, how much of what is being called gender identity is nothing other. Well, I'll go to gender. Gender is stereotype. Gender is stereotype, full stop. And it can be a feeling to someone who might regard that as their be all of their identity, just like someone might really relate only to people who bowl. All their friends are on the bowling league. They go to work and then they bowl. They watch bowling, they bowl. And I can go home and I've just made some pumpkin bread last night. I can say my pumpkin bread is the best. And Leor, if you do not say that, you're going to have the West Yorkshire police knocking on your door. And this happened to Kelly J. Keane, who's a feminist activist in the UK, although she wouldn't call herself a feminist, but she's doing the work of campaigning for women's rights around this issue. She's also come to the States many times, and she was at a swim meet, I believe, with Leah Thomas in the pool. The reality is that we are not being asked to be tolerant of, I'm going to be very crude or blunt here, depending on your vocabulary, but of men in dresses or women in trousers. Now, we all know I grew up wearing trousers. I didn't have to fight very hard for that. Coco Chanel 80 years earlier did, but I didn't have to. But men, obviously, they're on the other side of that struggle. If a man is wearing a dress, people will look, they'll ask questions, or today they'll just assume he's transitioning or something. Why should society have that task thrown at them as a nicety? Is it mean for anyone to say, well, Leah Thomas is a man? If my psychological well-being is dependent upon your telling me I make the best pumpkin bread in the world, it seems that we've got an ethical situation also as to how we embrace difference and how we expect these quote unquote persecuted minorities, which we both know they're not persecuted minorities. They even play around with the numbers about violence and murder rates. I saw that out a few years ago with the FBI, and I did the number crunching, and I got some statisticians to help me because I'm not a statistician. But we were able to figure out that the number one group of all violent related crimes, the number one group who's the subject of this, are men. Then women, then trans folks. So we're dealing with all these myths flung in the air, people reporting, you'll see this all the time, but they're oppressed, they're murdered at higher rates, they're beaten, well, when you want to talk about Brazilian transsexuals, we're talking largely about prostitutes. And if you want to talk about prostitutes around the world, they are highly victims of violence. That's just a fact. It can be New Delhi, it can be Rio, it can be New York or Seattle.
Right. So let me, I certainly agree with that. That last observation of yours, I think, is really important because so much of the, again, I'm going to talk about the American context, but this is relevant to other contexts as well. But so much of the legal and policy gains of the transgender movement here has depended on the framing of transgender claims as claims of civil rights. And any claim of civil rights, implies that there's a minority that's politically powerless, socially marginalized, and that's kind of where you have to throw these supposed facts about victimization and violence and murder rates in order to prove that this is in fact a marginalized minority. And yes, I think you're right that a lot of what they're picking up on when they make claims about murder rates is not the trans identification of the person who was being murdered is a poor proxy for why that person was murdered. They were murdered usually for reasons quite other than being trans, although it's certainly conceivable that in some of those cases, the fact that they misrepresented themselves to their clients probably had something to do with why their clients got mad and killed them. Not that that's a justification for murder, God forbid, but it's not irrelevant to the question. But as you point out, the very fact that they are prostitutes already puts them in a much, much higher risk category for violent victimization, independent of any issues of gender. So that, and again, you see that kind of thinking all across the board when talking about trans issues. It's the same thing with all the medical research literature dealing with pediatric gender medicine. When researchers claim that hormones reduce mental health problems, they never control for psychotherapy that the kids are going through anyway. And so they have no way to know if it's the psychotherapy that causes the improvement or the hormones, but they just tell people that it's the hormones and the media gobble it up. And then you get this whole narrative of, hormones are medically necessary and life-saving, even though nobody has ever proven that or even strongly shown that in studies. But I want to make 3 points kind of directly in response to the things that you said. The first is about social confirmation. And I think it's important here to kind of break this down analytically a little bit, because you're right that, I also cannot think of another example of a psychopathology, a mental health condition in which the treatment involves society's collective confirmation of the delusion. But this, I think, is where, so gender ideology can enter the picture here and solve the problem, so to speak, because you can say, look, it's not society confirming that a man is really a woman because he declares himself so. It's not society cooperating in the mental health delusion. It's society recognizing reality, which is that gender identity is really what makes a person female, right? So if you believe in gender ideology, that whole problem of, that you framed of, is there any other condition in which society is required? That whole problem goes away. Right, you've brought in gender ideology, kind of Deus ex machina, to solve that problem. Of course, if you do that, and this is the big caveat, if you do that, then the whole rationale for medical transition goes away, right? If the only thing that makes somebody a woman is the fact that that person has a female gender identity, why on earth does that person need surgeries and hormones?
That's a question the feminists ask all the time. Or as I like to say, right, if I'm a clinician and you think that you're really a woman, my prescription, I'll just write down this on my prescription pad. Mm-hmm. Go home, do all the housework, and give 30% of your salary to a woman. Like, I've read enough of your articles to now assume that you know about John Money and the birth of this condition, we'll call it. Right. I think this condition is largely what Michel de Certeau might call a science fiction, in the sense of, I believe that the diagnoses coming out post-war America, and we can talk about Christina Jorgensen, we can also talk about the fact that when this was going on and the diagnosis given to the child of a botched circumcision was to, we'll make your boy a girl and just raise him as a girl. That was the recommendation that was given in the case of the Weimar child. Now, David Weimar and his twin brother ended up having horrific ends to their lives. And it's quite understandable as to why. Aside from living a lie, aside from having your body mutilated first by an accident and second by interventions to which you never consented because you were both too young to consent. And in this atomic age of the 1950s, women were being brought out of the factories back into the home front. They were being told to get used to life in the kitchen, and here's your blender, and we've got all these new things. And sexism was a reality in the 1950s. And so was this fear of effeminate men. We know what happened to homosexuals in the 1950s and 60s. I have a good friend who was subject to shock therapy. The prognosis was, okay, we've diagnosed you with this, and we're going to give you hormones. Where was that leap? Because that's a huge leap to me. That someone feels like a woman, and talk therapy may or may not have been part of the process depending on the subject, but the medicalization of this psychopathology was to pump the individual full of estrogen and perhaps or not to commit to what is called today, and I have real problems with these terms, bottom surgery or whatnot, but was to commit to a removal of the testes and the penis, or an inversion of the penis to make a neovagina, and that was it. Game over. I have a problem with the way in which, I'll go back to Freud and French philosopher Luce Irigaray, who criticized Freud as making woman into a symptom. Indeed, now we've leapt from Freud, woman as symptom, to this postmodern era in which we're living, where woman is the cure. And I find them two sides of the same coin.
Okay, so regarding the Reamer case, John Money, I mean, it's, the failure of that experiment, and it was an experiment, of course, the failure of that experiment is actually what bred, I think, the trans movement in its current iteration, with its claim about gender identity being immutable, and unalterable through social forces or psychotherapy, anything like that, and therefore, as soon as it becomes evident, it has to be affirmed, because there's no way it's ever going to change, right? So paradoxically, Money's failed experimentation gave the trans movement a tremendous amount of confidence in the innate and immutable nature of gender identity. Because otherwise, the Reamer kid would have been raised and felt like a female, right? If gender identity is mutable and amenable to social forces, then why not? But let me kind of work through two of the things that you've put on the table that I really want to address. One is, you said earlier, gender means stereotypes. I'm curious what you have in mind there, because I mean, I'm not a feminist, and I'm certainly not a queer theorist. But when I hear somebody say gender is stereotypes, I guess my first question to you is, what do you mean by gender? How are you defining gender?
Well, I'm going through gender, even as Judith Butler describes in her work, as a social performance, she defines it differently from one book to the next, I have to say. In Bodies That Matter, she shifts greatly from gender trouble, but it's more performative in Gender Trouble. In Bodies That Matter, somehow it's now ingrained. That leap I don't really buy. What feminists say gender, we're talking about the idea from The Second Sex, when de Beauvoir says one is not born a woman, one becomes one. Paradoxically, the gender movement has leapt from that, saying, well, I'm becoming one. And that's not what she meant. She was talking about socialization. She was talking about the social politicization also of gender, such that, going back to my example, and we see this, Jordan Peterson talks about this as well. Statistically, women aren't getting paid what they should, he says, because they are not asserting that they should be paid that. And there are sociological reasons for why we are afraid to ask for raises and you insist on yours. Now, the stereotype from that is that I'm supposed to, like Laura Ashley, on Sundays, I dust the house with a feather duster. And I'm giving you outdated stereotypes because a lot of the gender movement, the transgender movement, has hitched its caboose onto these stereotypes. Now, when I say gender, I'm talking about the representation of what a woman is or should be. So I don't go to drag shows and see a woman wearing the latest in Kmart jogging wear with Crocs. I'm not seeing that. And once in a while, you'll get a ballsy transvestite on stage. And I'm thinking of the 90s in New York, who will put on a pantsuit and pull it off quite well. But that's a performance. I don't see that in the transgender movement today. It's this very reduced notion of what woman is to, some feminists say, pornographized images of women. Yes, I see that a lot. The reduction of woman as being very sentimental and feeling. So you get in a Twitter debate and suddenly the hurt feels come out. I've been off crying. And it's like, wait a sec, are we having an intellectual debate here, or are we going to play more into the tropes of being a weepy woman? I have a problem with the fact that all that gender has been advanced through this movement has been nothing but the same. I'll give you an example as well. As an anthropologist, I'm not seeing someone coming off the operating table saying, oh, I'm now Golda Meir, or I'm now Indira Gandhi. You're seeing very cultural specific impressions of women done by men who claim to be women. I mean, I'm not a mean person either, Leor. I mean, if I know someone is coming to my dinner party and they just stopped drinking because they had a severe alcohol problem, I will, in all likelihood, not even open wine at the table that evening, even if my other 6 guests drink. Like, I'm a sensitive person, But in terms of my having to go along with someone's self-image, their need to assert their mirror onto me, I now draw the line. And a lot of that came from that discussion with Julia Long, and a lot of it came from years of watching on social media and my own experiences with people I know who identify as transgender individuals who, when they transition, our relationship was always about, do I look like a woman enough? And I didn't want
Mhm.
to have a friendship with someone where I became their mirror. I sort of wanted
Right.
to talk about goldfish or the sky or the clouds. You know, I didn't want to
Right.
talk about that. And it's, to me, and I'm sure it's part of the pathology in terms of this, what some have called a hyper narcissism. It's all about me, or
Right.
as Joan Rivers says, enough about me. Let's talk about what you think about me.
Mhm.
And I think it's a movement that's fraught with many other types of psychological issues that have gone to the wayside or have been consciously pushed to the wayside. And you know this about autism within the girl demographic.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. And I think, anybody who's kind of looking at this, especially the way in which it manifests among teenagers, with objective eyes, that's not kind of an ideologue, can see that obviously this trans stuff is wrapped up in lots of other mental pathologies and social behaviors that are really new. Most notably, of course, social media. And there's a reason why the vast majority of kids nowadays identifying as trans are female. It's because girls are affected by social media in ways that are different and more profound than boys. We know that. Um, the status jockeying, the spreading of rumors, the concern for status, all those kinds of things manifest themselves in teenage girls in different ways than they do in boys. When we want to confront one another, we do it one-on-one and we beat each other up. When girls want to bully each other, they kind of psychologically tease and gang up and through social media and things like that, right? So all of these kind of underlying trends and behavior that where you do see average differences, and I'll get back to my question to you about gender in just a second, but all of these underlying trends of psychological behavior, I mean, I'm always struck by the degree of naivete of kind of trans activists, especially those who support the transitioning of kids, their utter naivete about adolescent psychology. It's astonishing to me. But let me get back to the point about gender and service. And the reason I asked you is because, let's define gender broadly as dealing with psychological traits and behaviors, okay, as opposed to just kind of raw facts about one's anatomical biological existence. Um, I think we know enough about human beings to know that there are average differences, right? You can between men and women, right? That men are more aggressive. That probably has a lot to do with our levels of testosterone, which are much, much higher, especially after puberty. And women tend to be more contextual in their thinking. I think it's no accident that if you look at kind of who's supporting trans activism on the ground, I mean, I don't mean the people funding it or running it behind the scenes. You see an overwhelming disproportion of women, especially kind of white liberal women, for whom this all comes down to just kindness versus cruelty. You don't see the same thing among men. Even men who support the trans issue, you don't see the same thing. So there are distributions of behaviors and psychological dispositions between men and women. You can call that personality, you can call that character. But I'm struck, for example, that the most vicious of trans activists, in my experience, are the males who transition to female or who present themselves as female, which in a paradoxical way confirms that men are more manly, they're more assertive. And the fact that they transition or want to present themselves as female doesn't negate that for a second. They're still a lot more assertive, they're more combative, they're more willing to confront aggressively people who disagree with them. Whereas trans men, meaning biological females, again, these are observations. I can't confirm this with any study, so I may be wrong, but this is just my own observations. Trans men, meaning biological females, when they do activism, when they confront their critics, it's always through kind of sharing of posts and ganging up with other trans men and, look at what this guy said, isn't that ridiculous, and things like that, right? So even, I would say the behavior of adult transgender people sometimes confirms the very beliefs that they're trying to destroy about the relative distribution of traits among biological males and females. But I would say that we have to be careful when we're talking about stereotypes, right? When we say something like gender means stereotypes, I'm not imputing any of what I'm going to say to you, but there are what you might call statistical stereotypes, meaning average patterns of behavior that most men and most women exhibit differentially from one another. And that doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions. Of course, there are exceptions, but the exceptions are exceptions that prove the rule. And then there are also normative stereotypes, which is how someone should act, right? So there's a difference between saying that most men are aggressive and saying that men should be aggressive in order to qualify as men, right? Those are two very different statements. So that's one point that I wanted to make, is that there are average distributions of traits and behaviors, and that these matter to our lives. And I don't think there's anything we can do about it. We can tinker it at the margins, but I think these differences among men and women are always going to exist in averages. And it's important to recognize that and to try to deal with that, right? The fact that men are more naturally aggressive and violent doesn't mean that we should allow men more leeway to commit violence than women. It just means that men need to be civilized more than women do. So that's one point. The second, on the one hand, I'm glad to see that a lot of feminists and gay rights activists are recognizing the dangers inherent in the redefinition of sex and gender and pushing back against it. I'm less inspired by those who claim, and I don't think all of feminists and gay rights activists claim this, but I'm less inspired when I hear things like trans activism is against feminism or is antithetical to gay rights. That just strikes me as wrong. There are ways, of course, in which both feminism and gay rights advocacy have kind of created the conditions for the trans movement to come into existence. And I think to deny that is not only intellectually wrong, but I think it's also counterproductive. So just to give you an example, even if you take the most moderate form of, or one of the most moderate forms of feminism, liberal feminism, I mean, I'm referring, for example, to the legal thinking of somebody like Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? Very mainstream liberal feminism. Her entire career was built on the argument that our body's natural reproductive capacities should have absolutely nothing to do with our social status, nothing whatsoever. And that should be reflected in social norms, in the laws, in everything. There's a very short step from that argument to the argument that our body's natural anatomy and reproductive capacities shouldn't determine anything about us, including how we identify. Obviously, it's a leap. Obviously, that's not what Bader Ginsburg herself had in mind, but it's a very short step. So, we have to try to understand we have to try to figure out a way to strike a healthy middle ground between, the Handmaid's Tale on the one hand, the kind of ultra repressive, sexual mores of yesteryear, and this kind of nihilistic understanding of the human person being advanced nowadays under the trans umbrella. There has to be some middle ground, but it's important to recognize how both feminism and gay rights, or in the case of gay rights, for example, the argument was that sex and sexuality should have nothing to do with reproduction on a normative basis. And that too, I think, paves the way to the transgender movement. It's obviously not synonymous with gender self-identification, and there's obviously a leap there. But to think that gay rights has nothing to do with the birth of the trans movement, I think is just insane. So, I think, look, let me summarize what I'm saying with this observation. I have seen among people on the right, I have seen more sympathy over the last couple of years towards gender critical feminism and gay rights than I have ever seen. And that's good and understandable. But I would also like to see sympathy and understanding from the opposite direction. I would like to see feminists and gay rights activists saying things like, hey, you know what? Maybe the relentless attack on the nuclear family was a little bit overblown. Maybe we failed to see something here. Maybe we failed to understand that men and women are different and should be taught to be different, and that's okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. And maybe we should be taught to think that heterosexuality is not some invention of an oppressive culture, that this is the natural condition of humankind. And yes, there are exceptions to the rule. I recently heard Douglas Murray say that I'm gay, and being gay is neither good nor bad. It's just something that exists. It just is. But for many years, there were a lot of gay rights activists who were not saying that, right? Who were saying, no, being gay is good. Well, if being gay is good, there's not a big leap from there to kind of the whole world of gender self-identification, liberating oneself from the shackles of one's biology and anatomical functions. So again, we have to find that middle ground between the repressive, world of very rigid sexual and gender norms on the one hand, and the world of total unfettered sexual self-expressionism of the gender identity movement on the other hand.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. I agree with the points you've made. I would add to it that in the 90s, there was that born this way versus choice within the gay movement. And there were scientists trying to find the gay gene. Remember that around 1994, 5, 6. And then you have the other issue that can't be omitted here. Gay rights in the era of AIDS took a new form. And we were living a community of loss, tragedies, men losing their flats because their lovers had died in the West Village. This happened all the time. I got involved with ACT UP over these issues. Ironically, what we're seeing with the transitioning of children and parents, like Susie Green, the CEO of Mermaids, flew her son to Thailand to have him castrated, and to the States to get treatment in Boston. And we can talk about Boston because there are hubs where the Pritzkers have put their money. I have questions about the way in which the gay rights movement adhered so vehemently to the tragedy of AIDS, didn't let go of it when it was time to let go of it, moved on quickly to gay marriage, but there was a hole left in these NGOs, and they filled it with the tea. And they filled it with the tea because one of the problems, and I do think there needs to be eventually some kind of oversight NGO or a kind of board that looks at NGOs' mandates, because I saw this in Haiti working in child trafficking. I'm very critical of what MINUSTA has done there, and look what's happening in Haiti today. Oh my gosh. We've created through US intervention in that country from the 1950s onward a banana republic and poverty. That country was very wealthy in the 50s. It is the poorest country in the hemisphere, I believe, along with Bolivia. And there are reasons for this. NGOs, there are more NGOs. There are something like over 10,000 NGOs on the island of Haiti. Now, that's insane. It's half the island, actually. So you've got this mandate to go in and do XYZ, but when that's not accomplished, or rather, as one of my colleagues from the Tier Fund said to me, we just move the furniture around. We keep the deck chairs moving so that the funders can come in and the money keeps flooding in. And when I was doing research for Gay Men's Health Crisis in the mid-90s, they were considering renaming themselves. They started just going by GMHC because the demographic of AIDS around 1994 shifted from being mostly gay men to being a lot of Hispanic, heterosexual women, men, African-American men and women. And there was a conflict with the name of this organization, who were our clients. And that's also when the client model came in. Patient went out the door, client came in. And we see that in universities. You can't say students now, they're clients. And the clientelism of the NGO sector, I believe, has played a role in this. And I would add that, going back to identity and gender here, when you want to know what gender is, I'll tell you what gender is. It's this. How many men have been told, and gay men's organizations have told their affiliates, well, now you have to suck a male clitoris. No, they're not being told that. Women are. You're not seeing men being called testicle havers or prostate havers. This is a very gendered war against women. In fact, I'd say the trans lobby does itself in. It makes own goals of affirmations about what the feminists are saying, because it's women who are expected to. I wrote a piece about this. Women are being expected to organize men's sock drawer. Why are women being asked to deal with Leah Thomas and not the men's swim team?
Okay, so here's maybe where there's a little bit of daylight between us, and not too much, because I am actually sympathetic to the critique that the trans ideology has a very strong misogynistic component to it. I think you can see that in kind of the displays of autogynephiliac men and how they think femininity is and should be perceived, and these kind of grotesque displays of femininity and things like that. I think it's hard to ignore that there's an element of misogyny in this movement. I think to the extent that it works to the detriment of women more than men, which I obviously agree with, I think it's hard to deny that on so many levels. But I would add one more very important level, is that the vast majority of teenagers who are going through these things and want to get medicalized are girls. So that's another way in which this has a negative effect on women, much more than men. But I think that that's the result rather than the intent of the gender identity movement. And what I mean by that is, trans men can play on men's teams, but nobody would care. They wouldn't get anywhere. Trans men can serve in men's prisons, but nobody cares because they wouldn't be able to beat anybody up, right? They would be at a physical disadvantage. So it's not like these, yeah, okay. I mean, so I've seen the phrase uterus havers. I actually have seen phrases of penis havers and things like that. I just think most men just look at that and kind of shrug it off, but they shrug it off because of the wider context, which is that these things don't affect men as much as they affect women, and men can stick up for themselves, and they don't see why this matters to them personally. Whereas for women, the effects are a lot more palpable and tangible in their lives. Public bathrooms, showers, things like that, right? If men in a men's shower room in a men's locker room in a gym saw a trans man with a vagina walking around naked, most of them would probably just stare, or not even. They would just kind of ignore it. Whereas for women, you can assume that a non-insignificant portion of the women in that locker room have probably experienced some kind of sexual assault in their lives. So for them to see a naked male body is distressing, to say the least. So yeah, it obviously redounds to the detriment of women much more than men, but I don't think that that's a design of the system. I think that it's just one of its unfortunate consequences. And I don't mean to minimize the consequence, but I do think it's important to recognize that there is a symmetry here. It's just that on the other side, the effects are just not that important. Most men don't care about them.
Well, yes and no. I'd say, do you know what Man Friday is?
No, I don't.
Well, Man Friday was a group of women who around 2017-18, this was so funny, they got together. Some would wear mustaches and whatnot, but they'd show up at men's swimming hours at local gyms around London, and then it spread around the country. And they'd show up and they'd swim in the men's swimming hour. And the men did not like it at all. Not at all. And it was phenomenal to watch. They made videos. I mean, it was funny. And they disbanded. And I wish they would keep doing it, because it was great comedy in a way for us, because we needed it. But I would say...
But did they not like it because, well, just to clarify, they didn't like it because they were clogging up lanes that were designated for men? Because if that's true, then there's a zero-sum game here, right?
No. The men wanted their privacy. They wanted men's time. They wanted the men's cave.
So it was about privacy and a male-only space or something.
It was about a male-only space. Them wanting to go and not see women's breasts and bras and curves. That was an interesting mini revolution happening there. And at the same time, you mentioned women who've been survivors of rape, etc. I actually dislike that kind of rationale that even feminists advance, because I think one of the things I've taught my daughter is that no is a complete sentence. And I think that I shouldn't have to be raped to have the right to say that sentence, if you know what I mean. All women, like I remember being 12 years old. I grew up in New Orleans from the age of 10, walking to the bus. And I was 12 years old, and there was a garbage truck going by, and a man whistled at me and said something that I couldn't quite hear. But it was likely a sexual comment. Later, as happened more and more as I grew up. Growing up as a female in any society is no picnic at a certain age, when you are no longer reading Anne of Green Gables I'm using stereotypes here, but suddenly you're being catcalled by
Yeah.
some dude on the street you've never seen.
Yeah, for
Now,
sure, for sure.
and men might say, "Oh, I like it." Of course you'd like it, because the woman who's just catcalled you is not going to rape you. Not that I think every man who catcalls me is, but this is the unfortunate equation of society. Who is raped and who rapes?
You're 100% right about that. And I just to clarify what I meant, I did not mean that women's concerns about having a naked male in the locker room matters only if they experienced sexual assault. I certainly didn't mean that.
No, I didn't assume you did. I was just
Yeah, no.
clarifying because what you said is something that feminists often say, and I'm
Yes,
like,
yeah.
wait, I don't want to go there.
Right. And no, I think you've actually just taught me something very, very important, which is that we shouldn't reach for rationales regarding rape and past history of sexual abuse when a perfectly more kind of reasonable explanation will do, which is that women feel uncomfortable in the presence of a naked male. And that's fine. They shouldn't have to explain further why that makes them uncomfortable. There's also, we have to take into account, of course, concerns about modesty, not just by religious people, which, obviously their concerns about modesty are also important and matter and are protected under our laws and things like that. But even a non-religious, even a secular person's concerns about modesty, there are plenty of teenage girls and young women and teenage boys and young men who just experience shame when in the vicinity, either they're naked in the vicinity of the other sex or vice versa, and that should be enough too. One of the things that really struck me when reading through a lot of these court cases on Title IX regarding bathrooms in schools is the extent to which judges, and I can explain why they do this, but judges have basically said, look, if you can't produce hard evidence of a student who was really traumatized by seeing the naked body of another student, or by having the student of another sex seeing their own body in a state of nudity, if you can't prove that, if you can't provide that level of evidence, I'm going to totally dismiss any concerns about privacy as being just a rationale for bigotry. And in fact, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals said that the argument about privacy is, and I quote, based on sheer conjecture and abstraction. I mean, that's a really remarkable statement, that there's absolutely no reason ever to take into consideration the concerns of privacy of teenagers unless there is hard evidence of severe trauma. That just strikes me as absolutely insane.
Well, the caveat also to this issue of rape always being on the table, it's not that a woman or a girl has to have been raped to have boundaries, it's that we are always conscious of it. I was conscious of it as a girl, absolutely. There were times I'd get out of the train in Brooklyn and I had to take out my headphones to walk on the street because I wanted to hear footsteps behind me. Now, men don't have to do that. Yes, you can be mugged at higher rates, and you are at higher rates than are we. But it's very implausible, statistically speaking, that you are going to be anything more than mugged. And it is statistically a fact that we will not only be subject to that. That's why I think it's really important that this movement, I'm floored. I'm going to go to a document. I'm responding to something in writing this week. And I don't know if you saw this. This was in the Nature last week. It's called "To Set Transgender Policy, Look to the Evidence."
By Paisley Curl, I commented on that on Twitter and tried to tag him. I think he untagged himself because it was embarrassing for him that his citations of the studies are totally wrong there.
It's a piece published by one of the most important science journals in the world that is full of what the British would say, it's bollocks. There was nothing that Current wrote that was correct at all. And the goalpost shifting, or the, what did you say? The lily pad leaping?
Lily hopping,
Lily hopping everywhere. One has to wonder, is nature being funded by big pharma? Is nature being funded by some lobby? We see this in the States with the proliferation of gender clinics for kids. Enter Boston hospitals. So many of them have catered to this clientele. And you have to put that in quoting marks, because I've been working on this subject for years. I got to know Stephanie Davis Arai of Transgender Trend when she was just starting out. And I was dealing, when I was in Brighton, I dealt with Brighton Hove. They had a packet which included the genderbread person, written by a person who has also done the sexuality tree, where in his sexuality tree, one of the types of sexuality is rape. Okay, you can look that up after. It's fascinating to see that a council like Brighton Hove has adopted a PDF without having investigated a thing about the maker of the PDF.
Yeah.
And genderbread is not just Mr. Potato Head. We're not
Right.
Mr. Potato Head. But let's get back to also the fact that girls are transitioning now at higher rates than boys. And of the two demographics, male and female, more and more the case is that males are not undergoing any kind of surgical processes. The females are. So this
You mean
feeds right
as
back.
minors? You mean as minors?
Yes. And as now as adults as well, by the way. When you start to look at the statistics of who is getting what is, again, this term bottom surgery, I hate it because it sanitizes what's really going on here in top
Right.
surgery. We're talking about the mutilation of healthy tissue of women. On Twitter just the other day, a woman, oh my God, it was yesterday, I believe, she wrote about how she remembers just last year they removed her breasts. They were right next to her. She could see them. And she's like, what were my doctors thinking? Like, she's already a detransitioner 1 year later, less than a year. And it's really daunting to see how the transgender lobby has refused to hear the voices of detransitioners. They try to make it out as a minor category. But then, I just contacted Paul McHugh today. And I'm trying to talk to him as well. He was part of the decision-making process in 1979 that closed the Johns Hopkins
At Hopkins,
clinic. Yeah. Now, there was a reason for it. And the reason was they were not showing positive results for these interventions. You start to look at the science and the data. Well, go back to the Tavistock, and the judge ruled against what the Tavistock was doing effectively. I'm cliff noting it here. But basically, one of the major reasons for this is shocking to me. They did no follow-up studies, no follow-up data, nothing. So we're seeing more detransitioners coming out of the woodwork day by day, and it's becoming a huge demographic. How many more this week and next week? Now, we're not also seeing data to show that there's any kind of somatic basis for what is called gender dysphoria. But the answer to this is somehow take these hormones, get these surgeries if you wish or not. That's very troubling that we have a medical procedure that was born in the post-war era, the height of sexism in the US, because the 1950s was a particularly repressive era. The 1960s didn't come out of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
And this was the result. The antidote to feeling like you are in the wrong body is to make you the other body? Like, no.
Okay, so there's a few things here. I think first, I think it is important to recognize that there are some people who do experience this agonizing distress over being associated with their bodies. It's a visceral experience from what I've read. It's a visceral experience, and it's a aversion or a rejection of one's body and its parts and processes. It's not a visceral rejection of gender norms. That's a really important point that some people don't understand. Is that people who actually have severe gender dysphoria, it's the body itself that gives them that experience. And that's why they want to change it. It's not society's understanding of their body. So that's a really important distinction. And we also, we know that for a lot of these people, who I shouldn't say, using the word a lot of these people can be misleading because it's a tiny, tiny number of people. Some of them report that their feelings began in childhood or in adolescence. So I think it's important to recognize that there is a dilemma here. And that dilemma is that there's a severe psychological condition and that some people do experience an improvement in their quality of life after they've so-called transitioned as adults or whatever. But the obvious difficulty is, can we pick out the kids, the true trans kids, right, from among all the other kids who experience distress over their bodies? And of course, we can't. There are no diagnostic tools that allow us to do that. Some people argue there's no such thing as a trans kid. No kid is born in the wrong body. Fine. I can subscribe to all those arguments, but I could still argue, right? And this, to go back to the original point that I made about there being two different discussions here. The philosophical discussion is anybody born in the wrong body, and the medical discussion of what is the best way to manage gender dysphoria. I can agree that no kid is born in the wrong body, and still also think that if we, by an act of magic, had the ability, the uncanny ability to peer into a person's soul and know that they are destined to have severe gender dysphoria for the rest of their lives, I'm open to the idea that it could be beneficial for them to do puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and even surgeries. But our ability to know that is zero. And I don't see that ever changing, or at least anytime soon. So for that, so effectively, my position on pediatric gender medicine is the same as those who take the more metaphysical position, say nobody's born in the wrong body. We arrive at the same result. So, but look, I mean, yes, these procedures are they shock the consciousness, right? And or the conscience, I should say. They shock the conscience of anybody who's not an ideologue. And those of us who have been observing this from the side are kind of screaming, "Where's the evidence? Show me the evidence!" And we go over the studies that the activists cite, and when you look kind of in detail at what these studies say and what they don't say, and what the authors themselves say, there's nothing there. So far there have been a number of what's known as a systematic review of evidence, which is a method of evidence review that's designed to prevent cherry picking of studies in order to produce a desired result. So Sweden did one of these, Finland did one of these, the UK did two of them, one for puberty blockers and one for cross-sex hormones. And all three countries came to the same conclusion, that there is no evidence that the benefits of these interventions, the mental health benefits of these interventions, outweigh the risks. None. That doesn't mean that one day there won't be evidence, but at present, we have no such evidence.
If you recall, in 2000, there was the infamous case of Dr. Robert Smith in Scotland, who was amputating people who believe themselves to have what is called BDD, body dysmorphic disorder. Yeah. And that was made quickly illegal, because medical ethics boards said no to this. Now, if we just look at I'm going to be vulgar here, but the lobbing off of a limb or genitals, I'd say the latter is the crueler, because one can somehow get around disruption in their mental thought, thinking, oh, what was I thinking? I had my left arm taken off. They'll live with that. They can still have a happy, healthy life. When you start to remove intimate organs, which means that your reproductive life is gone, that your ability to have healthy sexual relations, including orgasm, is removed, then whoa, we're really getting into categories of, going back to the Ramar case, this child was left not only without a penis, but then all other sensitive parts of his body were removed and made into something else. Yeah. There's little recognition by the transgender lobby to say some of these surgeries have done harm, because the detransitioners have organized. There are now many groups of them around the world. You see them on social media as well. There are films made by them and about them. And they speak very clearly about what they've been through. Some of them, in fact, are not even children. It wasn't like they started this project when they were 13. They feel like they were not given the options of talk therapy, that they were quickly, and you mentioned her in your, oh my God, Diane Ehrensaft. Yeah. I mean, I have seen so much by this woman. I just throw up my hands. That infamous talk where she says that if a child pulls off her onesie and she wants to wear a blue onesie, then she must be a boy. And if a girl pulling out her barrettes, and I'm thinking, oh, MFG. That's all I can think. Yeah. Because this is incredibly reckless. Anyone who has a child, I mean, you don't have to be Maria Montessori for goodness sake, but you know that children go through phases. So whenever this kicks off on social media, every so often, maybe every few years, I'll post a picture that I took in a SpiceJet airplane when my child was around 1. All the pilots and co-pilots were all women that day, and they loved my daughter and took a picture. We were going from Delhi to somewhere else in India. And I say, well, my daughter actually wanted to fly. So I'm not going to let the whole airplane oppress her desire to fly at the age of 1. Like, is that where we're going with this? This is so insidious. Yeah. And we know that even children in their teens, I mean, come on. If I were allowed to make the choices that I wanted, there were things I wanted to do that were really nuts. I was in the Army in my teens. I jumped out of an airplane many times at Fort Benning, Georgia. If you told me now to do that, I'd be like, no way. You know, there are things that you do when you're young that you just won't do when you're older. And the reason is that our cerebral cortex is not completely developed. Our brains, it depends on what studies you read, are not fully developed until 26, 28, roughly.
Yes, that's right. That's right. You know, I'm struck. You mentioned Diane Ehrensaft. I recommend to your listeners who have the time, but more importantly, the masochistic urge to do this to themselves, to read her book, The Gender Creative Child. It is, I'm not kidding, it is one of the most remarkable illustrations of the total superficiality of the trans movement. This is a woman who is incapable of having a deep thought, incapable. And what's interesting, and you know, another kind of very revealing aspect of this book, and this is true of kind of the broader way in which the trans movement tries to kind of instantiate its ideology in schools, is just the total aversion to scientific language, to precise language, and the substitution of that language with kind of glittery, child-friendly metaphors and things like that. So throughout the book, she never really gives a definition of gender. She just compares it to, you know, different types of cars and mythological figures and shapes and colors and sizes and appliances. And it's just a mind-bogglingly dumb book. But it does, I think, provide a very interesting glimpse into the mind of somebody who thinks this way. So, for example, just to give you 2 quick examples, at one point in the book, you know, we know now that kids with autism are very, very vulnerable to transgender ideology, because it gives them a narrative for why they feel socially isolated and awkward. I think in the review of the Tavistock Clinic in the UK, they found that up to 1/3 of the girls who showed up there had autism or other neuroatypical conditions. 1/3. I mean, that's very, very, that's a red flag right there, right? So Ehrensaft, in her book, Ehrensaft says, I kid you not, she says, one day we might learn to think of gender transition as a cure for autism, a cure. And there's 0 citations that she gives for that claim, 0. But another claim that she makes, because you just brought this up, if I remember correctly, and your listeners might want to fact check me, but if I remember correctly, you know, Ehrensaft's big argument is this, I know, is that people like her have the ability to pick out the true trans kids, right? And she uses this test of, if a kid is insistent, persistent, and consistent in his or her gender self assertions, then we can know that this kid is a true trans kid, and we can start the transition process very, very early, even as young as 2 years old. As opposed to kids who say, I want to be boys who say, I want to be a girl, or girls who say, I want to be a boy. According to Ehrensaft, statements of I want show that this is not a true trans kid. And what's interesting is that throughout the book, she constantly confuses I am with I want statements. She can't even keep her own story straight. This comes up over and over and over when she gives an example of a kid who by her own definition is true trans, and she gives examples of what that kid has said in therapy. She uses I wish or I want type statements. And the other thing that I remember from the book is that she discusses Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie's daughter, Shiloh, who came out as a boy and now has since kind of reverted back to being a girl, to Shiloh. And if I remember correctly, Aronsof gives Shiloh as an example of a true trans kid. So, I mean, it just shows that these people are incapable of thinking analytically and profoundly on the subject they write on, and their ideas do a tremendous amount of harm. And Aronsof was behind one of the major forces, so I am told, behind the closure of the attack on Dr. Kenneth Zucker at the University of Toronto, because he practiced what's known as watchful waiting, meaning he didn't immediately affirm a child as their gender self-identification the moment they made it. So, these activists are behind kind of the corruption of medicine in ways that are just really distressing. But again, for those readers of yours who have the masochistic urge, I recommend reading through The Gender Creative Child, if only to get a glimpse of what kind of mind is behind this phenomenon.
I've read that book as well, and I am flipped out constantly by what passes as scientific knowledge around this subject. There are advocates within other types of medicine who can get very rough around the edges when certain kinds of solutions are proposed. As I learned after my first article on this subject came out in 2013, I had received loads of death threats. It was quite awful for me. I had to leave the UK for a few months. Death and rape threats, including to my then 6-month-old daughter, my editor and his daughter. It was awful. I went to a cafe one day and I was like sort of recovering from it all. My daughter was taking a nap. And there was a woman at the next table who was reading a psychology book. We started chatting. I told her what I had just gone through, and she says, "That's fascinating because I work on something where we've had similar reactions." And I said, "Oh, do tell." She works on, I'm going to get hell now for what I'm about to say, but she works on, no, I'm afraid to, because I wrote another piece about this and it was pulled within 4 hours. But because my editors were threatened again. But she works on chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, she works on the issue of the socialized groups around that. Not that chronic fatigue syndrome does not exist. No one's saying that, folks. But she works around the fact that when they were working on CBT and GET therapies, and she mentioned a clinician there in the city, she talked about the death threats that she and her team received, and this clinician as well. And he was the head of the Royal College of Psychiatry. He has still to this day to get his mail x-rayed, and because the death and bomb threats were regular, and it was the vitriol around, how dare they not confirm what we feel? How dare they say we shouldn't do this, but do that? And it's very similar with what's happened in the trans lobby. The idea that, and you point out this in one of your articles, that when concessions were made about bathrooms, for instance, and this is what the feminists really pick up on, wait, you've been given a third option. And no, that wasn't enough. You couldn't take the separate toilet. You had to go and push to be in the men's or the women's locker room or toilets. And that set off something with the feminists saying this is about pushing our boundaries. They don't want to just have their private space. They want to invade ours. They don't want to be on and create their own sports teams. They want to be in ours. And it's hard to disagree with that because I've seen this time and time again over the past decade, talking with people, online debates, where what is desired and what is commanded here is absolute capitulation. It's not about accommodating this group. It's about ceding women's spaces to this group, where again, men are not being asked to. Cancer research at UK does not refer to men as testicle havers. And it's a ritual with women to be dehumanized in public and even private businesses in a way that makes it very clear this is about eroding women's boundaries and girls' boundaries for that matter. On the show, I've also had one of the runners from Connecticut who lost out on one trick after the next because boys showed up and won the meets, and she lost scholarships because of this. This isn't just about I'm not going to be the winner. It's about how am I going to pay for college now?
Yeah, no, so I agree with almost all of that. I think, again, I just want to reiterate that I think I think I'm just a little bit uncomfortable with the phrasing of this is about erasing women's rights. I think that it's a consequence of this movement that it erases, that it kind of uniquely erases women's rights and privacy concerns and things like that. But I don't think that that's the point of the movement. I think the reason why it seems to be that way is because, again, the impact on men is much less tangible than on women. So it seems like, again, from a kind of a disparities perspective, as opposed to a discriminatory intent perspective, it seems like it's targeting women uniquely. But that seems to be more the effect than the intent. Now, some of your listeners may say, okay, so that, potato, it's a distinction without a difference. Who cares? At the end of the day, that's what it does. And fine, I'm sympathetic to that. But where I want to caution here is that way of phrasing it, that way of framing it, that this is a deliberate assault on women and women's rights, is part of, I think, a broader narrative of feminism that says if we only were all more feminist, none of this would be happening. And I think that that's half true, because I think that feminism does have some important insights that can inform how to push back reasonably and intelligently against this stuff. But I think that also kind of quietly tries to conceal, to hide feminism's real culpability in producing this movement. And I can also, if you want, I mean, this might be a topic for another conversation, but I'm happy to walk through kind of the legal history of how in the United States, the trans movement's accomplishments have grown out of the women's movement, women's legal movement. You would not have the trans movement today if not for feminists and the legal arguments that they were making in courts and in the law reviews and in the public sphere. So I agree with you that is the consequence of this movement, but I'm just a little bit uncomfortable with saying that that's the intent.
You know why I say that? A lot of trans individuals say they're ruining it for us. I've gone through hell to get surgery, to live my life. And these idiots, I mean, half of them, most of them now, today, they say most of them aren't even transgender. This has become a social fad.
Right.
And I can't disagree with them when they say stuff like this. So when I'm saying the trans movement, I'm not talking about those folks. I'm talking who want to just live their lives and get on with their lives. I'm talking about the lobby that has become quite vociferous and making attacks upon women's rights specifically because they can. And when I see Chase Strangio at the ACLU tweeting daily about the trans misogyny of feminists, I'm thinking, well, you've just co-opted two words and put them together. Because I have a real problem with men claiming that now feminists are being the real misogynists here. Like it's again, Mr. Potato Head with language here. So we get ourselves into this hall of mirrors where you try to figure out what's going on. And my bottom line has changed over the years. I take accountability for the fact for many years I was using preferred pronouns. And I do think now I was part of the masses that did that. And maybe if I said no back in 1993, and more women would have seen me saying no. And this goes back to the legal issue. In 1950, whatever, when people were able to transition, where their legal records were able to be changed and so forth, did any legal scholar think that this would one day avalanche into what it's become today? Of course not.
No,
because
I
they
don't
thought
think
this
so.
is going to be 1 in a million,
Right,
1 in a
right.
million. We can just live with that. That's fine. But now it's not 1 in a million.
Right. I think they also saw it still through kind of a mental disability lens, meaning that they understood that these people had a kind of a mental pathology, a deep disturbance, and that these things are not socially contagious. You can't, through a process of social interaction with people or certain ideas becoming fads, you can't all of a sudden experience transsexuality. I think that was the assumption back then. Whereas nowadays, that trans identity has been is being depathologized, is being normalized, is being set up not only as part of natural human diversity, but in some ways as superior to cisgender identity because it's authentic, right? It's non-conforming. I think that thinking has changed 180 degrees. But yes, I think you're right about your characterization of the legal history.
Well, you see Katie Montgomery in the UK who goes on about being a better woman than women. And this
Yeah.
is something I've seen quite a bit from the likes of Katie Montgomery and cohorts. And
Yes.
it is disturbing to me. At the same time, I always say, look, I've had 3 children. I still don't know what it's like to feel like a woman. I just know that I am one. It's not like I wake up again and I'm like, oh, get me my smelling salts. I saw a fly. The idea that we are supposed to be codified within this kind of Victorian image of us, and that you're supposed to be covered in auto grease and have a wrench in your
Yeah.
hand is
Yeah.
preposterous to me. And what's
Right.
happened recently in the UK with a lot of gay rights activists now speaking out, and the formation, this is the best, I mean, the chutzpah of mermaids to take LGBT Alliance to the Charity Commission to try and have them disbarred of their charity status has come
Mhm.
back to bite them on the ass, because
Oh,
last
yes.
week,
Oh,
now they're
yes.
being investigated. And, that expression of be careful what you wish for is true in this
Hmm.
case. Mermaids, I mean, no one has talked about what Susie Green did to her son. And
Mm.
yet the UK has very strict laws for anyone going back to Yemen to perform a clitorectomy on
Yeah.
their daughter.
Right.
And somehow
Right.
this gets a
The double
pass.
standard there.
Well, a lot of double
Yeah.
standards, including the BBD surgeons who have performed amputations because the client says, my arm ends right here. I think we have a lot to account for as a society where, on the one hand, we can say, Rachel Dolezal, what a fraud. That no one can be black. I mean, she's white. And it's offensive that she just put on a little tanning cream and did her hair up. And on the other hand, the same person will say, but that's insensitive. You have to use preferred pronouns. She's a woman. Like, there's a lot of speaking out of both sides of the mouth, intellectually speaking, on this point.
That's right. And I, one thing that I say on podcasts and in my writing, and it angers some people, and for reasons that you could probably figure out why, but um, there's a lot of kind of banging on and on about gender ideology. And I can explain, if you want, why I think that that's a very imprecise and to some extent unhelpful concept when trying to describe the ideas animating transgender movement. But one thing that I've noticed is that so much of the actual gains on the ground, whether it's taking over school boards, pressuring local school administrators to revise their bathroom policies, voting on in referenda regarding things like that, right? So many of the policies on the ground depend on just left of center voters who are totally uninformed about the particulars of the ideology, to say nothing of the medical literature, who just want to be kind. For them, all of morality reduces to the imperative, be kind. And be kind, they interpret as don't be judgmental. And don't be judgmental, they interpret as don't care what somebody else is doing if it doesn't affect you personally. So there's kind of at bottom, it's a kind of apathy. And the philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville famously warned in his book Democracy in America that this is what democratic societies tend to produce, this kind of individualism and apathy, a total lack of concern for anything that doesn't directly affect me. And you see this, for example, in Matt Walsh's documentary, What is a Woman?, where he goes around and interviews people trying to get to the bottom of why they adopt these really bizarre beliefs. And one time after the other, you get the same results. They believe these things because they don't see why they should object to them. It doesn't bother them personally. So why should you just not be kind, meaning non-judgmental, meaning apathetic, and just go along with what somebody else says? If it's your reality, fine. As long as it doesn't affect me, why should I care? And I think that so much of the support, certainly in the United States, in the context of our partisan politics, Democrats versus Republicans, so much of the support for gender identity policies in education and medicine depend on a large body of citizens who are, they want to do what's kind and compassionate, but for the most part, they're apathetic because they don't see how it concerns them personally. And they just want people to do whatever floats their boat. And this, it's probably not going to surprise you that this tends to be more women than men who think in these terms, and that certainly shows up in opinion polling. Women are more supportive of gender self-identification than men when it comes to school policies and medical transition and things like that. On the other hand, I also observe how women are sometimes the most the fiercest fighters at the forefront of pushing back against this stuff. So that's also quite interesting too. But the kind of natural female empathy, which women have obviously more of than men, empathy, I mean, not female empathy, but just empathy, seems to be driving so much of this stuff. Whereas the actual ideology, you spend 5 minutes talking to your average white suburban liberal mom. You ask her, explain one idea of Judith Butler. Assuming she even knows who Judith Butler is, she will not be able to do it. That's not why she supports this stuff. In fact, if she had read Judith Butler, Michel Foucault, she would know that the idea that human beings have a true sex or gender identity is a product of these power discourses. If she had read Judith Butler and Michel Foucault, she would be even more suspicious of medical transition than people like you and me. So that's why I'm hesitant to call this gender ideology, because I think it's more just apathy that happens to find an outlet in gender. And obviously, when you kind of work your way up the ladder, when you're going from the average citizen on the ground to kind of the ideologues in the universities and in the medical field, people at places like the American Academy of Pediatrics, or in certain university departments, or certain journalists in the media, and elected officials in the Democratic Party, there you're going to see a little bit more adherence to gender ideology, although even there you see a lot of very confused and self-contradictory ideas held by the same brain. And you wonder, how can this brain be a functioning one if it can't even get its own story straight? So that, I think, raises a slightly more puzzling question of how could you believe these two contradictory things, assuming that you have even given this stuff some thought, which you clearly have. And then at the very top of the ladder, I think you see kind of the Pritzker phenomenon, right? Very often autogynephiliac men, some gay men too, deep pocket donors, who seem to have both ideological and financial interests in fueling this machine. So I think it's important to distinguish between those three levels of the trans movement. Kind of the foot soldiers on the ground tend to be more female, effusively and sometimes irrationally empathetic, have not really reflected on the ideas animating the trans movement, but just want everybody to be kind, meaning apathetic. And then the middle level, kind of the ideologues and the universities and media and everything. And then the top level, the people who seem to have more than an ideological interest in promoting this stuff.
I absolutely agree. And I would add on to this that I think the dearth of this movement is housed within the upper middle classes. It's not something that if you go to the local brewery and ask the workers there what a woman is, you're going to get a more tight definition of it that will be replicated by medical science.
Right.
You're not going to get, let me tell you, Joe, what do you think? No. And I think there's a reason that we saw Shiloh transition, but we're not seeing a lot of lower income families producing these children. There's a caveat to this as well, because I did interview a filmmaker in India recently who talks about that, in fact, in India, it's happening in the lower classes because the caste system has fed into this. And there's a certain kind of politics in India that's its own podcast, but that does grasp the vulnerability of poor members of society there. Right. But in the English-speaking world, for sure, this is something that is coming out of elite institutions. Gender studies departments wiped out feminist studies departments, or they were merged with them. So you get gender and feminist study, like whatever. And I do have to say that for all my years of saying I'm not a feminist, which I did for so many years, because I'm a Marxist, I work on class issues. That's ultimately what I see being derailed by this movement as well. That suddenly Elizabeth Warren is worried about she, her on her Twitter profile. But what has she done for the people who couldn't pay rent during lockdown?
Right. But I mean, in her defense, she does at least claim to care about those kind of bread and butter economic issues and economic inequality. Whether the solutions she proposes are rational and good ones is a separate question. But she at least does show some concern. But you as a Marxist, let me ask you, has it ever struck you that the reason why we see kind of gender ideology, and again, I don't like that term, but let's use it. If there's a reason why gender ideology seems to spread like a wildfire among the professional white collar class, but not among the blue collar working class, I mean, to me, a major cause must be that people who are in the working class work almost by definition in professions where the gender differences are visible and relevant. If you're a police officer, obviously there's a huge advantage to you being a man over a woman, because as a woman, you can't apprehend certain people. They're just going to overpower you easily. If you serve in the military, and we know that there's class divisions in terms of military service, obviously there's a huge advantage to being a man over a woman in terms of combat ability. And the same with firefighters and all these kinds of things. And even kind of let's say the softer vocations, plumbers, electricians, those are physical jobs. It doesn't mean that women can't do them. Timber workers, whatever, right? These are all any job that involves physical labor is going to have usually a distinct advantage to men over women. And so if you come from that world and you live and breathe that culture of work, it's going to make intuitive sense to you that men and women are defined by their physiology, and that these distinctions, sure, there are always going to be exceptions, but they're relevant and they matter. And we can't override our biology by wishful thinking. Whereas when you go to the kind of the middle class, the professional class, as you pointed out earlier in your comment on male and female brains, the distinctions between men and women intellectually are only observable at the very extremes of very high and very low intelligence, right? There's more men than women at both of those extremes, at the highest extremes of intelligence and the lowest extremes of intelligence. And yeah, there are other kind of soft skills that are relevant to the white collar workforce, but by and large, the differences between men and women among the professional class are relatively negligible. So, if you're thinking about a pediatrician, a woman is just as capable of being a phenomenal pediatrician as a man. So if you grew up in a family of doctors or lawyers, the differences between the sexes are not obvious to you. Why we should even insist on them, let alone kind of defend them in the face of a prosecutorial wokeness. So, I mean, as a Marxist, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you'd have to be at least sympathetic to an explanation like that, right? Where the ideas that we have in our heads about things like sex differences are to some extent shaped, maybe even determined by the underlying material realities in which we live.
Yes, absolutely. You have the material reality of sex, however, that we're seeing I think this goes back to the managerial class, the way that universities have been completely restructured such that in many institutions you have more managers than you do professors. You've got so much happening where grants, I know when I wrote my PhD thesis and I was applying for grants, I pretty much had to stick gender in there I got the funding, but there was a currency of language that you needed to reflect.
Yeah.
And this happens in higher education. And a lot of this stuff has come out of universities with the help of funding. But it's not just that. I'm someone who came from academia. I transitioned to journalism. And one thing I learned in this shift in career was how the media works. Now, when I wanted to submit that first piece I did in 2013, on the war between feminists and transgender activists in the UK, I could not submit that to most any leftist publication. I finally got one that did publish it, but they no longer do. They told me at one point several years later, we can't do any more gender critical pieces. They've been running a lot of trans pieces. Now, the reason being that there is a cultural cachet and being able to use language to empower yourself. And I think this is very related to a Marxian reasoning in the sense of, well, what happened around the time of this surge of transgender identity? Could the .com crash, the Wall Street crash have something to do with it, where all of my students from NYU were finding jobs as baristas, very few in their chosen fields and professions? It was very hard. And you see this too, I'm sure, where kids are coming out of university and they opt to go to graduate school because, hey, I'd take on debt rather than be employed as a barista. And this feeds back into the class issues. And Ehrensaft is not poor. These people are making a good living peddling snake oil.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real ethical problem there as well, going back to my comments about how NGOs need to be given some kind of oversight. How
Right.
was it that LGBT charities suddenly tacked on the T? The article you wrote last week, in fact, you talk
Yeah.
about several polls and that deal with the treatment of children and of the teaching of gender ideology in schools.
Mhm.
And there's great irony here in what's going on, even in terms of the way that some schools and some districts are forbidding conversion therapy. Are we talking about what conversion therapy? Gay conversion therapy? Or that's going on today where you're telling young girls, most of whom are lesbians and or are autistic, that they're really boys? Because
Yeah.
that's gay conversion therapy.
Right. I think it needs to be said clearly. Gender affirming care for at least a substantial minority, if not a majority of people, of young people who get it, is gay conversion therapy. That needs to be said loud and clear, because that's what the evidence, and again, there's no like, conclusive evidence of almost anything in this field, but the evidence that we have points in that direction. That if you just leave these kids alone, most of them will come to terms with the fact that their feelings are a reflection of same-sex attraction and not being trapped in the wrong body, or any kind of other metaphysical claim. But I think your observation about the soft infrastructure of the trans movement, the groups, the organizations, is spot on. I mean, for me as a political scientist, because that's the field I come from, that is one of the most relevant aspects of this whole story in the American context. Our system is designed, our political system is designed to make it very difficult for majorities to act. And the way in which it makes it difficult for majorities to act is by providing what's known as veto points, meaning these are points at which organized interests can enter into the policy process and stop a certain law from going forward. And since the 1960s, they've also become very capable of entering the policy process in order to produce new policy changes without majoritarian approval, without legislation. And so interest groups in the United States have much bigger role than they do in almost any other democracy. So if you think about kind of the whole slate of LGB organizations, right? GLSEN, I'll include the ACLU here because it's played a huge role in gay rights and trans rights. GLSEN, the ACLU, the Human Rights Campaign, National Center for Lesbian Rights, GLAAD, Lambda Legal, the Trevor Project, GSAs, right, the Gay Straight Alliance, now it's called Gender and Sexuality Alliance. These organizations, until roughly 2015, were either more or less indifferent to the trans issue, or even in some cases outright hostile to it. They were about gay marriage and workplace discrimination above all. Those were the two most important things. And when the Supreme Court effectively took away the marriage issue in 2015 by constitutionalizing a right to marriage all across the United States, these organizations all of a sudden were left without the main raison d'etre of their existence, for which they managed to attract not only donations from deep pocket donors and foundations, but also talented lawyers, ambitious lawyers coming out of elite law schools wanted to go into these organizations to work on the marriage issue. So, what usually happens when these institutions realize their goal? Do they declare mission complete and go home? Of course not. They're staffed with these highly ambitious, young, very smart, very talented, very ideological lawyers and staff. And they immediately kind of do what's called mission creep, right? They find something that's close enough to what they were doing previously and start activism on that front as well. And so you had a whole ecosystem of interest groups and foundations and donors and journalists who are connected to them and Democratic Party officials who just, all of the infrastructure was there, and they just, in a heartbeat, they just pivoted to the trans issue. And it made it look to the kind of the average American who wasn't paying attention, who doesn't have this kind of political science sense of how our system works. To the average American, it looked, I should say, as if this stuff had been brewing for many, many, many decades, when in fact it hadn't. It's not like there wasn't trans activism feminism. Of course there was. I mean, the word itself only really entered mainstream discussions in the 1990s, but transsexuals were discussed and to some extent visible on the very fringes of American politics in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But it seemed, and I think for a lot of Americans still seems, that this stuff has a long, well-established pedigree, whereas in fact it's a classic story of institutional mission creep, reorientation, capture, whatever kind of framework you want to impose on it. That's what happened here, and that's why the movement has been so incredibly successful in such a short amount of time.
That too, in addition to the media being a major part of this, both major media and big tech, I should say, because I've witnessed dozens, if not hundreds of women getting kicked off of Twitter for saying he's a man. And this is a real problem where the public square has been transformed, especially since lockdown, into the virtual reality governed by Jack Dorsey, and all these big heads are able to decide what is and what is not acceptable speech, such that feminists have lost their spaces. Some came back under new names. Many did not. Many were like, no, I'm going to go to Getter, even though it's right wing.
Right.
People are not really happy about the fact that you got the Soros Foundation gave The Guardian $250,000 2 years ago to run pieces on trans issues. You've got the Pritzkers funding clinics around the country. And, you should take a look at Jennifer Billick's work on this. She's been tracing the money
she's
behind
wonderful.
this.
She's wonderful.
There's a lot to say for how ideology has been left to creep into the public consciousness through people like Don Lemon on CNN talking about this. And it's a tangential issue, but it should be addressed. The disappearance of women now. 2 men have a baby and the mother's not there. She was the surrogate, but now she's been disappeared. And a lot of feminists are connecting dots between all of this because there's a huge problem within the gay community that now we can outsource women's bodies and call it a day. And that's their nuclear family. This goes into all sorts of other aspects that you hinted upon earlier that we really have to come to grips with, both within the gay community and society at large.
Yeah. So again, let me kind of segue back to the feminism question, because it seems to me that a lot of kind of the, let's call it the meat market that's on fully and unashamedly on display in kind of transgender medicine today, where it's all just kind of, bodies, personally curated bodies. I want a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Give me, a little bit of facial hair, but I want, a penis with no testicles, whatever, right? I'm being facetious a little bit, but you understand what I mean.
Right.
This kind of meat market, this understanding of the human person, of the body as just a vessel, a vehicle for the autonomous self, which is disembodied, to kind of do with it as it pleases. I think you have to be willfully ignorant of feminist history to not see. I'm obviously not claiming that you are. I know that you're not what I'm about to say, but you have to be willfully ignorant of feminist thought and history to not see how this has a strong lineage in feminist thinking. The idea that we should have a right of autonomy over our body and its reproductive potentials and processes. It's hard to ignore that there's a strong overlap between the abortion issue and the trans issue. And yes, you can definitely be pro-choice and be anti, medical transition for kids. I think you can have a consistent philosophical position that way. But I think in general, if we're offering kind of higher level reflections, the idea that the human being is a person that exists independent of and in total sovereignty over his or her body, that medicine is a tool for us to create these kind of personally curated physical experiences. There is a strong overlap there with ideas such as I should have a total right of autonomy and choice over everything that goes on in my body. And so again, I'm not suggesting that if you want to be anti-medical transition for kids, you also have to be anti-abortion, not at all. I am suggesting, however, that we have to think carefully and deeply about the moral principles, about the philosophical anthropology that's animating these movements. And I would like to see just as I have seen among some people on the right. I'm not going to say that it's everyone, because it's not, but on some people on the right, I'm starting to see a little bit more sympathy for feminist arguments about gender stereotypes, gender roles. I'm seeing sympathy towards gay rights, and an emerging understanding that as radical as gay rights may have seemed even a decade ago, there's a way in which it's actually more moderate than conservatives may have thought, that it's more pro-family, more pro-reality, grounded in kind of an appreciation for the body and its limitations in a way that we previously didn't think. In the same way that you see conservatives moving maybe an inch or two to the left, I would like to see feminists and gay rights activists moving an inch or two to the right. I think it's really important that we acknowledge the shortcomings of the ideologies that have animated our thinking for the last few decades.
I see what you're saying. And I think what I've been witnessing in the UK specifically, where there's been a lot of accusations amongst feminists who collaborate across party lines, they've been lambasted as Nazis, as racist. It's quite vile to witness when these are women saying, well, women exist on the right. I want women to join arms and fight against this, because women who are conservative are still women, right? They still have the right to privacy, et cetera, et cetera. And you see these purity leftists going about calling names to these women. And it's shocking to me, the lack of solidarity, even amongst what is a single issue movement at this point. It's actually given me quite a few lessons in humility in my former wokeness. When I was younger, I had my wokish moments.
We all did.
Yeah, and I think it's very important that we learn to listen and stop this. Well, you've seen it on Twitter where a trans activist and a feminist are discussing something, and the feminist says, and the trans activist says, you're a racist. That came out of nowhere, but that's the go-to card now. And it's very odd to me to see these derails of discussions, because the answers aren't obtainable often on the trans side. And then you see the infighting amongst feminists, where you went to the Heritage Foundation. Well, I sat in the audience. They invite. Well, you went there, and it becomes really splicing hairs for what is ostensibly supposed to be a movement about women's rights. So we're supposed to just dump right-wing women on the corner and like fix yourself, your issues? No. And it's really been eye-opening to me to witness.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I mean, there's kind of a push, and by the way, this is true on the right and the left. You can see these kind of pushes for purity tests. I like to tell people I don't like purity tests, and I have no room for purity tests in my coalition. If you do purity tests, I don't want to be in a coalition with you. Some people don't get the joke, but regardless.
It's a twist on Woody Allen, isn't it?
No, but I mean, American politics in particular, I think the way our political system is set up is by design intended to force these coalitions into existence. Meaning if you practice kind of purity politics, you're going to be shut out. For the most part, you're going to be shut out of power for a long time. There will be hiccups in which you do have power. I think we're seeing one of those hiccups right now. But by and large, coalitions are what govern the day. And I've been pleasantly surprised to see people on the left and on the right be willing to work with one another, collaborate, publish in one another's magazines, read and share one another's articles, knowing that they disagree about everything except for the trans issue. And that's a good thing. That gives me hope that we can still kind of set aside our ideological commitments when we recognize that there's something that's just demonstrably and obviously wrong that needs to be addressed.